Welcome, everybody, back to the Spurs Insider Podcast. We are back here at our luxurious sound studio with the Blackhead Crates, all for your listening pleasure to talk about the new Spurs season. I am Mike Finger. I'm here with Jeff McDonald and Tom Orsborn. We're taping this well into the first week of training camp. And I guess to start out with impressions of what you guys have seen so far.
What we've seen, like with our eyes?
Yes.
Lots of free throws, some conditioning.
Anything that surprised you so far?
Tim Duncan doing conditioning.
That's an interesting topic to start the podcast with. This
Is it really?
is the most popular, probably the most intriguing assistant coach in the history of the NBA.
Okay.
I did find, because you're not going to participate fully right away and want me to go ahead, I will say that I found what Greg Popovich said on the first day of media day, I guess it was, where he kind of talked about how, and this is nothing shocking, but he did not try to convince Tim Duncan at all to become a head coach, that it had to be completely on Tim Duncan to volunteer to want to do it, and that he does not think that this is going to be a long-term career for Tim Duncan, but it's something that he's going to take advantage of right now. And it might be silly to talk about the assistant coach, but from what you guys have seen so far, what do you think Tim Duncan's impact can be with his team?
Yeah, I mean, you don't know, but I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it'll be great.
Going to turn Jakob Poeltl into an all-star.
Yeah, something like that.
He's been working a lot with Jakob. I say that jokingly, but Jakob talked to us today and talked about the extensive work he's been doing with Duncan.
I think the one thing, I mean, aside the obvious, that he's not only a great player, but a kind of a thinking man's player. That one of Tim's attributes was that he thought the game so well. But on top of all that, he's not that far removed from actually being a player, and I think he can bridge that gap between the communication gap sometimes between the old man coaches and old lady coach. Sorry,
who was it that said
Dejounte Murray said, he's one of us. He speaks our language.
He knows how to talk to us. That was Dejounte.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
Why don't you just get Dejounte on here? He can explain it better than I can.
We have the invitation is out there for Dejounte to come into the sound studio. We talked about over the years in terms of players who become coaches, and a lot of people always thought that it would be interesting if Manu ever did it. But Manu is, to your point earlier, Jeff, Manu did not think the game. Like, he played Manu style.
Yeah, he can't just go out there and say, hey, just be Manu.
Right.
Do what I do. Did you ever think about trying to throw it between the defender's legs? Why didn't you try that?
So, like Manu, one of the smartest athletes we've ever covered, one of the most intellectually curious, all that type of stuff. But I think to what your point was earlier, Tim probably thinks the game in a way that applies more to just to other players than Manu would. And in a way they can use that type of analytical style that Tim used more than they would from Manu just playing with his hair on fire, as Pop used to say.
Improvisational, jazz-like, yada.
It's interesting because Hall of Fame players, more often than not, don't end up being great coaches just because of what we mentioned. It's like, I'm Magic Johnson. Just be like Magic Johnson. You guys will be great. It doesn't work that way. One of my favorite, there was a span there for a while in the mid-aughts where the Spurs defense had sunk from its previous levels, where one of my favorite emails, I'd get them 8 times a year, was like, why don't they just hire Bruce Bowen to come teach defense?
Right. I'm
like, that's not how it works, really.
Yeah.
But with Tim, I think that you have a chance. I mean, there's something there more than he was just a great player.
And with Tom just mentioned as an aside there, something about jazz musicianship along those lines. And I think there's a difference between the guy, like the piano teacher at home who's teaching you scales and what have you, and like the technical stuff, and then whoever, Dizzy Gillespie, I don't know who's a Satchmo, can't necessarily teach you how to be Dizzy Gillespie, but Tim Duncan probably has all the scales down pretty well, all the music theory, that type of stuff. That probably applies more than a Manu type of thing.
Yeah, he can crank out a perfect pop song, 2.5 minute pop song where, that's fundamentally sound, where Manu's, improvisational.
What are we
jazz.
talking about?
We're trying to make analogies.
All right, we spent 10 minutes talking about the assistant coach.
Jeff seems to not be in a great mood today.
Great players, like we always use Magic and Larry Bird as an example, they get frustrated over guys who can't achieve maybe not their level of greatness, but their commitment. Do you see that happening with Tim, or is he more understanding and has that degree in psychology and will be able to work with these guys and not get frustrated?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what he'll be like as a coach.
One thing that the guys keep saying over and over is he's been around already.
Yeah.
So like in being in that practice facility, and Jeff joked earlier about always see his free throws, but throughout the course of a season, you see the guys getting extra work after practice, and that's usually like the 15th, 16th guys, the G League type guys who are still getting extra work. And Tim was working with those dudes for the past couple of years, those guys who were kind of like the
Chimezi
Metu
and
the Blossom Game and those type of guys.
Dedrick Lawson told me today that he's been working with Tim.
Right.
Tim's been helping him with his low block moves.
So to your question, Tom, I think Tim is the kind of coach, and again, acknowledging the caveat that he's probably not going to be a lifelong coach, but he's doing the work with the guys who are kind of the total opposite of him in terms of talent. Like Tim always was uniquely talented. Tim's been working for years with guys who are just trying to get that 15th roster spot. So I think it's a really fascinating. We kind of make fun of the attention that Tim has gotten as an assistant coach, and that there might be bigger stories and more important stories to this team than that. But it's a fascinating thing because, like Tom said, he's a Hall of Fame player. He is unquestionably more talented than a lot of the guys he's coaching. But to see how that plays out and whether or not he's going to get bored to death, flying to Memphis and Minneapolis and Charlotte throughout the year, is he going to want to do this again? I think it's going to be really fun to watch over the course of a year.
All right, now let's do Will Hardy.
Will Hardy is an up-and-coming star, I think. And I know you didn't want to talk about Will Hardy, but the whole coaching staff is interesting. People don't want to hear about that, but Will Hardy, Becky Hammond, Tim Duncan, heck of a coaching staff.
The Becky Hammond watch begins Saturday.
Pop refused to take the bait on will he have Becky take over whenever he inevitably gets kicked out of a game. But we all know that's probably going to happen. What are they trying to accomplish in this training camp as a whole?
Why don't you tell our listeners at home exactly what you mean by training camp?
I think we need to stop with the sarcasm from the lead Spurs beat
Well,
writer.
then I should just leave.
Training camp is the portion of the schedule.
All right. I'm getting a phone call. How about that?
Should we pause?
I'm good. I don't need it, but take it. I just interrupted.
All right, then kick it back in so we can cut it.
Okay.
Just ask your question again.
We will go back to
and I'll answer for real. Sorry.
What we talked about. We're going back to the training camp in 3, 2, 1. In terms of training camp as a whole, what does this team need to accomplish in the next couple of weeks before the season starts?
Well, I think the one thing is to figure out who the starting lineup is going to be. Like I think that maybe is sort of the fundamental thing we're trying to figure out, because you get Dejounte Murray back. We're assuming he's going to be your starting point guard. So what does that do to the rest of the group? I mean, I think we're just sort of assuming Dejounte is going to be the starting point guard. That hasn't been announced or anything. Right. But aside from that, LaMarcus is going to be in your starting 5. DeMar DeRozan is going to be in your starting 5. And what does the rest of it look like? I think that's sort of what, at least to me, one of the things that's going to be interesting in this camp and this preseason is how they organize all that, because it could go a number of ways. There's a number of different elements to balance between three-point shooting and
going big,
defense, going big, going small. So there's a lot of pieces in place. And we did talk to Jakob Poeltl today, and he sort of told us it's been all over the map so far as him being with the starting 5, out of the starting 5, Dejounte Murray and Derrick White being together, not together, has been a sort of a grab bag, mix and match so far, which is
as
what
you
would
expect. Yeah.
With the understanding that there's probably going to be more than 1, more than 2, more than 3 starting lineups throughout the year.
Sure.
Let's say that there's going to be a lot of mixing and matching.
Matchups.
I will put the question to both of you, 2 questions. What do you think the starting 5 will be on opening night, and what would it be if you were the coach?
This is just a total me guessing, but I think it's going to start Dejounte Murray, Derrick White, DeMar DeRozan, LaMarcus Aldridge, Jakob Poeltl, but I don't really like that offensively very much. That just seems like
so. That's your guess as to what
seems
will
like
happen.
a log jam.
What change would you make, Coach McDonald?
Got to get some kind of shooting in there, I think, unless LaMarcus is going to take threes, unless Derrick White has improved his three-point shooting, you've got to get some three-point shooting in there. And one way to do that, would be to put Rudy Gay at the 4, but he's not he's not Steve Kerr. He had a great three-point shooting year last year. I think he shot a career high, so maybe that's the answer. But I don't know. Do you keep Bryn Forbes in there and bring Derrick White off the bench as sort of your kind of bench fire starter? I don't know.
Tom?
I think they definitely need shooting, so I wouldn't be surprised if Forbes does start, and I would go with Rudy starting for that purpose as well, just initially, because those two guys are very flexible. You can pull them out and change the lineup. There's going to be no complaint. That wouldn't be the case with anybody on this team probably, but it just seems like the safe thing to do is to start in that way.
So Forbes instead of Derrick White and Rudy instead of Poeltl.
One or the other.
Right.
One of the other starts, I think.
But
I think
get shooting on the floor.
Then you look at you just got to be. You talked
floor.
all about how poor the defense was last year.
Yes.
You want it to get better. I mean, you've also got to be tempted to look at that and go, Derrick White and Dejounte Murray as a defensive backcourt
Yeah.
would be just.
That's a great
That's what we want to
point.
do. That's what we want to do.
There's also a difference.
But it kind of.
That's
it
the
kind
other-
of. It hurts you the other way.
There's
That's
also
what
a
I was talking
difference
about
between
earlier.
the starting lineup and the finishing lineup.
Sure.
Yeah.
I just don't see how any of this works with LaMarcus and Poeltl together start. Like I think that's the most obvious first change you make is just make Poeltl your backup center, have LaMarcus play the 5 now, even though he calls himself a 4. He is for.
That's what he needs to be.
But
now
in
is the
every
5, yeah.
sense of the word in the modern NBA, LaMarcus is a center. I mean, most centers shoot more than he does, in terms of 3-point shooting and perimeter shooting. So, I mean, I think that's I don't know if Pop is going to do this, but I think that's the obvious first step is, okay, LaMarcus is your 5. The 4s are now, the Rudy Gay, DeMar Carroll, those type of players. And then, like you mentioned earlier, the Derrick White, Dejounte question, it wouldn't be a terrible thing to have one of them on the floor at all times, and
Right.
then maybe double them up at the end when you need a defensive stop. But start one or the other, have one or the other come off the bench. And that lessens, like if you start them both, Dejounte and Derrick White, then your bench becomes Patty Mills and Bryn Forbes. And that's really hurting defensively. The shooting is much better. Yeah. So I think, again...
Not to mention Marco's defensive liabilities. Yeah.
Right. So if you do the Derrick White, Dejounte Murray starting together, your starters are really good defensively but really hurting 3-point wise, and then your backups are really good 3-point wise and hurting defensively. So I think the solution there is to kind of stagger them. And... will that be? I mean, you've hyped up Derrick White all offseason. He made the national team. He had a really good offseason. Will he be the type of guy that can handle coming off the bench? I think he's fine. I mean, he doesn't seem like the type of guy who's going to pout about that. And Dejounte probably wouldn't either. Maybe start one some games, start the other some games, see how it works. But that is probably agenda item number 1 to watch throughout this preseason, and he'll probably tinker in the preseason games, correct?
Yeah. Where does Lonnie Walker fit in all that?
Again, these are the questions that we were asking like a year ago, and everything sorted itself out through injuries and attrition. So there probably will be opportunities for all these guys, but that's another guy to think about. He had a really good summer league, and he would seem to be in line to take that Spursian second-year leap after spending a year in the G League. So if that's a problem that Popovich has, is to try to find minutes for all these guys in the backcourt, it's not a bad problem to have.
Heard that today from one Jakob Poeltl.
Man, he's just been all over the place today.
Jeff wrote a bit to start the week about DeMar DeRozan. What do we expect from him this year? He seems to be the type of guy that a lot of fans get frustrated with, or maybe have been dissatisfied with so far. How do you think he fits in, and is this going to be a better year for him?
I think he'll be more comfortable for sure, and that can only help. I don't know that you're going to see many drastic changes in what he does and how he approaches the game. I think everybody, including the coaching staff, would probably like him to take more three-point shots.
Yeah.
That the jury's out on whether he will, and if he does, at what rate he will convert them. But other than that, I think you're going to see pretty much the same player you saw last year, which isn't a terrible thing all the time.
Yeah. I mean, replacing Kawhi Leonard just skews
Right.
everybody's
Right.
Opinion and I guess the perception of what he is. He's a top 20 player in the NBA. I mean, and without him, they don't make the playoffs last year. Without LaMarcus Aldridge, they don't make the playoffs last year. Both of those guys are kind of easy to kind of downplay what they do and how important they are. But and it's not the sexiest thing to talk about a team led by DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge. But I mean, those are guys that a lot of teams would like to have, and they kind of guarantee they're going to be boring, and they're not going to, light up. They're not going to be among the league scoring leaders and make crazy highlight plays all the time. But if those two guys in your lineup all year, you have a pretty good shot.
Are you buying what he said Monday about his the contract situation, not thinking about it at all, never having
not.
thought? Yeah.
Of course not.
So how does that weigh in with his motivation?
We've talked about this on the Spurs Insider Podcast multiple times before about that decision that's looming, and I think they have a while to decide whether they want to. We're talking about DeRozan here, whether they want to extend him or not. That's going to have to be made in the next couple of months. And it's a question that we haven't had a definite answer to on the Spurs Insider Podcast, and I still don't. Like, you can be swayed either way. On the one hand, he's probably not your classical definition of a guy who's worth the max contract. I mean, that's clear. He's not a top 10 player, but he might be the most efficient, the smartest use of that money, because if they let him go, it's not like there's James Harden's beating down the doors trying to get in here. It's not like Giannis is trying to get in here. They're going to have to use that money on somebody, and he's a guy who, as long as he's around, he gives them a shot. That's what I'm thinking.
Speaking of guys you want to extend, are we extending Dejounte Murray almost sight unseen?
What is the deadline there? Is that the similar?
Before the season starts, basically.
They already have to update on the news of the week. They made decisions on Derrick and Lonnie Walker, but those
weren't really
kind
decisions.
of fundamental. Those were obvious, picking up the option years. But yeah, Dejounte Murray is another guy who it's not max money, it's not DeRozan money, but I think that's a guy you probably just give what you can give.
I think you do.
Mm-hmm.
I think you do, even if you're not really sure what he is and what he looks like coming back off the energy. I think you have to.
What he is that they don't have a lot of. And the way he's different than DeMar and LaMarcus is you already know what DeMar and LaMarcus are.
Right.
Like they have high floors, but their ceiling is kind of like what you know they are. DeJounte's a guy who might flame out. He's coming off an injury. That he might not be what they expect him to be, but he's the one guy, and even if it's a long shot, even if it's a lottery ticket, he's got superstar potential.
Yeah.
I mean, not LeBron James or Steph Curry, but he's a guy who can be a star player in this league, and you kind of have to keep that around.
I think so. I think he will be. I think that defensive force that he started out to be, making second team, will continue. I think he's going to get better and better there, and he certainly embraces being the point guard. He likes that role, and he's good at it. I think he's got those leadership qualities. To me, the question is the injury. Is he injury prone? Is that going to be a problem?
Again, that's a legitimate concern, but that's the type of player who, if you're the Spurs, you just have to wrap up and hope that he becomes that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Kawhi Leonard is the guy that they kept around knowing that someday he could be they didn't know that he was going to be what Kawhi Leonard became, but knowing he had a chance to be something all-star-ish. And maybe Murray doesn't become that. You don't strike gold over and over again with these guys, but that's why you keep him around. So, I would say that decision is much easier than the DeRozan one, even if I think that they probably will end up extending both.
I agree.
What are the other priorities for the preseason? Is there anything else that we don't know about this team?
They've been banging the defensive drum a lot, but that's always going to be the case with Pop. But I think it's even more so this year.
Yeah.
After last year's showing.
There are 30 teams in the NBA that want to play better defense and at a higher pace.
Yeah.
At this time of year.
But
I do know that Pop, I mean, obviously he got tired of just watching his team just get routed last year defensively and never feeling like he had a handle on a game. I think that got to be really frustrating, and I think that's something they're going to try to address, and one way they're going to address it is getting the guy we mentioned back from a knee injury. That would be helpful.
Tom mentioned Marco Bellinelli in passing earlier, and I think it's those types of guys. Like he's filled his role for what they expected him to be. Patty Mills, beloved, such an important part of this franchise for the past several years. But I think those are the types of guys, and this isn't necessarily a slight at either one of them, who goes back to Jeff's question about what do you do? Where does Lonnie Walker's minutes come from? I think it's from guys like that. And those are great guys to have on the roster. Like, again, some fans want to just burn it all down and get rid of those guys. They're great to have as your 12th, 13th guys. And maybe they play less this year. But I think that's where some of the Lonnie Walker minutes comes from. If you need more minutes for, Dejounte and Derrick, if one of them comes off the bench, I think maybe Marco plays less, Patty plays less, and that's probably fine.
Yes.
Do you disagree?
No,
No,
I don't.
Don't disagree.
And also, I would think that those are two of the types of guys who aren't going to, fume over that. Like they're professional guys; they'll be fine with it.
Sure.
Yeah, Patty. He's there when you need him.
Yeah.
If he needs to start at point guard a little bit, he's there. He's going to come off the bench some games and hit a big shot and win a game like he did last year on a time or two. That Tony Parker game when Tony came back, Charlotte, he hit the game winner.
To me, the future of this team is in the young guys, the Dejounte Murray, Lonnie Walker, Derrick White. And if I'm the coach, if I'm running this thing, this is probably the year that they need to play more than the older guys. I mean, they're more the future of the team, I think, even than LaMarcus Aldridge and DeMar DeRozan. Not saying I would not play those guys, but I would make sure that youth is served this year as much as possible, almost sink or swim.
What we've written already along those lines is, like, you kind of know what you're going to get from DeMar and LaMarcus. And like I said, people waiting for them to change, like, don't hold your breath. They kind of are what they are. And so, to me, if Dejounte becomes what they think he can become, if Derrick becomes what they think he can become, that says a lot more about how far this team goes than whether LaMarcus and DeMar change. I think that bottom line, we're about to wrap up this podcast, but I think the bottom line for the season is less about whether LaMarcus Aldridge starts shooting three-pointers and DeMar DeRozan becomes an all-star again. It's less about that than it's about Derrick White and Dejounte Murray and Lonnie Walker.
Have they all three improved their perimeter game?
Right.
Yeah.
If those guys become not necessarily all-stars, but guys like frontline NBA starters, then the Spurs are going to looking okay. They're not competing for a championship necessarily, but they're looking okay. We had a few weeks off from the Insider Podcast during the downtime, but this is going to become regular again. Want to encourage all of you to subscribe to the Spurs Nation newsletter. That will give you all kinds of updates throughout the week. You can get that on expressnews.com. We will be back soon, probably regularly throughout the year. Appreciate y'all listening. And until we see you again, we'd invite you all to keep it real.